The spotlight was blazing hot on Louis Armstrong's face when he saw the old man collapse in the front row. It was March 15th, 1960, and the Riverside Theater in Milwaukee was packed with 2,400 people who had come to hear the greatest jazz musician in the world play the songs that had defined their lives. But at 9:47 p.m., in the middle of "What a Wonderful World," everything stopped. Louis was halfway through his signature song, his trumpet gleaming under the stage lights, when he noticed the commotion. A white-haired man in the second seat from the aisle had slumped forward, his wife frantically shaking his shoulder. The woman was trying to be quiet, trying not to disturb the show, but Louis could see the terror in her eyes. The band kept playing. The audience kept listening, most of them unaware of the drama unfolding in the darkness beyond the spotlight. But Louis Armstrong saw everything. He lowered his trumpet and stopped singing. The band, confused, played a few more bars before trailing off into silence. 2,400 people held their breath, wondering what was wrong with their hero. "Ladies and gentlemen," Louis said into the microphone, his voice calm and steady, "we're going to take a short intermission." He handed his trumpet to the piano player and stepped down from the stage, walking directly toward the front row. The house lights came up slowly, and suddenly everyone could see what Louis had seen. An elderly man unconscious in his seat, his wife crying softly as she tried to wake him. "Is there a doctor in the house?" Louis called out, his voice carrying to the back of the theater without the microphone. The old man's name was Arthur Kowalski. He was 73 years old, a retired steelworker from Milwaukee who had saved for 6 months to buy tickets to see Louis Armstrong perform. This was his birthday present to his wife, Dorothy, who had been listening to Louis's records since the 1920s. Arthur had been feeling chest pains all week, but he hadn't told Dorothy. He didn't want to worry her, and he certainly didn't want to miss this show. He'd been a jazz fan his whole life, and seeing Louis Armstrong perform live was something he'd dreamed about for decades. Now he was unconscious, his breathing shallow, his skin gray and cold. A doctor from the audience rushed forward, Dr. Patricia Williams, a cardiologist who had been enjoying the show with her husband. She knelt beside Arthur, checking his pulse, listening to his chest. "He's having a heart attack," she announced quietly to Louis and Dorothy. "We need to get him to a hospital immediately." Dorothy Kowalski looked up at Louis Armstrong with tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "We don't have a car. We took the bus here. I don't have money for an ambulance." Louis didn't hesitate. "My car's right outside," he said. "Dr. Williams, can we move him safely?" "If we're careful, but we need to hurry." What happened next became the stuff of legend in Milwaukee. Louis Armstrong, the most famous entertainer in America, personally carried Arthur Kowalski out of the theater, with Dr. Williams guiding his steps and Dorothy holding her husband's hand. The entire audience watched in stunned silence as their evening's entertainment became something much more important, a race against time to save a man's life. Louis's Cadillac was parked in front of the theater, gleaming under the marquee lights. With the doctor's help, they carefully placed Arthur in the back seat, with Dorothy beside him and Dr. Williams monitoring his condition. Louis got behind the wheel, and they sped through the Milwaukee night toward St. Mary's Hospital. During the 15-minute drive, Arthur regained consciousness briefly. He looked around, confused, and saw Louis Armstrong's face in the rearview mirror. "Mr. Armstrong?" he whispered. "Am I dreaming?" "No, friend," Louis said, his eyes focused on the road. "You just hang on. We're almost there." "The show," Arthur said weakly. "Dorothy, we're missing the show." Louis glanced in the mirror again. "The show can wait, Arthur. Right now, you're the only show that matters." They reached the hospital just as Arthur's condition began to deteriorate again. The emergency room staff, alerted by Dr. Williams's phone call from the car, was waiting with a gurney. As they wheeled Arthur into the hospital, he grabbed Louis's hand. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for caring about an old fool like me." Louis squeezed his hand gently. "You're not a fool, Arthur. You're a jazz lover. That makes you family." Back at the Riverside Theater, 2,400 people were waiting. The house manager had announced that there was a medical emergency and that the show would resume shortly. But as the minutes ticked by, the crowd grew restless. People had paid good money to see Louis Armstrong, and some were starting to demand refunds. Louis could have sent word that the show was canceled. He could have stayed at the hospital and let the audience figure out what to do. After all, he'd already gone above and beyond what anyone could expect from a performer. But that wasn't who Louis Armstrong was. An hour later, he walked back onto the stage at the Riverside Theater. His white shirt was wrinkled from carrying Arthur. His jacket was missing. His carefully styled hair was disheveled, but his trumpet was in his hand, and his smile was back on his face. The audience erupted in applause, not just for his return, but for what they had witnessed. Word had spread throughout the theater about what had happened, about how Louis Armstrong had personally saved a fan's life. "Ladies and gentlemen," Louis said into the microphone, "I want to tell you about my friend Arthur Kowalski." He told them about the 73-year-old steelworker who had saved his money to buy tickets. He told them about a man who loved jazz so much that he ignored chest pains to hear his hero perform. He told them about Dorothy, sitting in a hospital waiting room, praying for her husband's life. "Now," Louis said, "Arthur can't be here to enjoy this show, but I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to play this next song for him and for every person who's ever loved music enough to sacrifice for it. And tomorrow, when Arthur is feeling better, I'm going to go to that hospital and play it for him personally." What followed was the most emotional performance of Louis Armstrong's career. He played "What a Wonderful World" again, but this time it wasn't just a song, it was a prayer, a celebration of life, a testament to the connections that music creates between strangers. When he reached the line about seeing trees of green and red roses too, his voice broke slightly. He was thinking about Arthur Kowalski fighting for his life in a hospital bed. He was thinking about Dorothy sitting alone in a waiting room. He was thinking about all the people who came to his shows not just for entertainment, but for hope. The audience was crying. Grown men who had come to hear some good music found themselves weeping for a stranger they'd never met. Because Louis Armstrong had shown them something they'd forgotten, that we're all connected, that every person in that theater was someone's Arthur, someone's Dorothy. The show went on for another hour, but it was different from any performance Louis had ever given. It wasn't about the music anymore. It was about community, about caring for each other, about the idea that a famous man's time was no more valuable than an old steelworker's life. After the final song, Louis made an announcement that stunned everyone in the theater. "Ladies and gentlemen, Arthur Kowalski's medical bills are going to be expensive. He's a retired man on a fixed income. So tonight, instead of selling you programs and souvenirs, we're going to pass the hat for Arthur and Dorothy. Every penny will go to help them with the costs." The response was immediate and overwhelming. People emptied their wallets, pulled off jewelry, wrote checks. A businessman in the balcony pledged $500 on the spot. A group of steelworkers from Arthur's old plant who had come to the show together collected money from their entire section. By the end of the evening, they had raised over $3,000, enough to cover Arthur's medical bills and then some. But the story didn't end there. True to his word, Louis Armstrong went to St. Mary's Hospital the next day. Arthur was stable, awake, and embarrassed by all the attention. Dorothy was by his side, still unable to believe what had happened. "Mr. Armstrong," Arthur said weakly, "you didn't have to do all this. I'm just one old man." Louis sat down beside the hospital bed, his trumpet case in his lap. "Arthur, let me tell you something. I've played for kings and presidents, for millionaires and movie stars. But you know what? None of them ever needed me the way you did last night." He opened his trumpet case. "You came to hear some music, and by God, you're going to hear some music." For the next hour, in that sterile hospital room, Louis Armstrong gave the most intimate concert of his career. He played for an audience of two, a retired steelworker and his wife, and he played with all the passion and joy he'd ever brought to the biggest stages in the world. Other patients started gathering in the hallway, drawn by the sound of that magnificent trumpet. Nurses stopped their rounds to listen. Doctors found excuses to walk by the room. By the time Louis finished with "When the Saints Go Marching In," there were 50 people crowded around Arthur Kowalski's hospital room, all of them witnessing something magical. Arthur lived for another 8 years after that night. He and Dorothy became regular fixtures at Louis Armstrong concerts whenever he played in Milwaukee. They would always sit in the front row, and Louis would always acknowledge them with a wink and a nod. When Arthur finally passed away in 1968, Dorothy sent Louis a letter. She told him that her husband's favorite memory wasn't their wedding day or the birth of their children, but the night that Louis Armstrong stopped his show to save Arthur's life. "He used to say that you taught him the most important lesson of his life," Dorothy wrote. "That music isn't about the performer or the audience, it's about the love that connects us all." Louis kept that letter in his trumpet case for the rest of his life. Whenever he was feeling tired, whenever the pressures of fame and travel got to him, he would read Dorothy's words and remember why he became a musician in the first place. It wasn't for the money or the applause or the fame. It was for the Arthur Kowalskis of the world, the people who loved music so much they would risk their lives to hear it, the people who reminded him that every note he played mattered to someone. The story of that night in Milwaukee spread throughout the jazz world. Other musicians started talking about the responsibility they had to their audiences, about the connection between performer and fan that went beyond entertainment. Some critics said that Louis Armstrong had been unprofessional, that he should have let the hospital staff handle the emergency while he continued the show. But those critics missed the point entirely. Louis Armstrong understood something that many entertainers never learn, that his real job wasn't to play music. His real job was to remind people that life was beautiful, that love was possible, that in a world full of darkness, there was still light. And sometimes the most important way to do that wasn't with a trumpet, but with your own 2 hands, lifting up someone who had fallen. The Riverside Theater still stands in Milwaukee today. There's a plaque in the lobby that tells the story of March 15, 1960, the night Louis Armstrong stopped his show to save a fan's life. But the real memorial isn't made of bronze, it's made of memory, of the story passed down from those who were there to their children and grandchildren. It's the story of what happens when someone famous remembers that fame is just a tool, not a destination. It's the story of an entertainer who understood that the most important performance of his life happened not on stage, but in a hospital room, playing trumpet for 2 people who needed to be reminded that they mattered. And every time someone tells that story, Arthur Kowalski's name lives on, along with the lesson he taught through his near-death experience, that love and music and human kindness are all connected, and that sometimes the greatest artists are the ones who know when to stop performing and start living. Louis Armstrong once said that music was love, and love was music. But on March 15, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, he proved that sometimes love means putting down your instrument and picking up your humanity. And that, more than any song he ever played, was his masterpiece.